Hi everyone, so in this video we're going to be looking at the Locarno Treaties and the Kellogg-Briand Pact. We're just going to discuss what they are, and really this is all about kind of how the League turned out to be quite insignificant in the peacemaking process after the First World War. Given it was made as a part of the League, of the Treaty of Versailles. It was suggested by the USA, who didn't then join. Its aim was to solve international disputes, to encourage international cooperation, to disarm. It was basically there to be an organisation to keep the peace. And what we'll see here is how, because of the membership of the League and because not all of the countries in the world were in it, we then have to have these separate agreements that include specifically and especially the USA, because their absence from the League of Nations is one of the main reasons that it failed. Spoiler alert there, it doesn't keep the peace, because we do have the Second World War. So we'll see here what these separate agreements were and why they were needed outside of the League. And actually, again, how the League's main players were actually part of these separate agreements. So again, undermining, going around not having faith in the League themselves. So let's have a start then by looking at the Locarno Treaties. So this was in 1925. So the League at this point has had 5 years around about to ensure that peace has been kept. So we saw in the last video when we looked at the League in the 1920s, that by this point it has failed in Poland, it's failed in Upper Silesia, and it's failed in Bulgaria. Succeeded in Bulgaria. It's failed in Corfu, again because of it going around, the members of the League going around it. So let's have a look then what happened in 1925. So we're still talking about the relationship between Germany and France. Remember, at this point in 1925, Germany is not a member. They weren't allowed in until they could prove that they were an international player and they were going to behave themselves, basically. So the relationship between Germany and France was still very hostile. It's only been 6 years since the end of the First World War. So France was rebuilding after being ravaged by war, and Germany was rebuilding after the Treaty of Versailles left the country devastated at the insistence of France. So both countries are rebuilding, both aren't in a positive state. France had even invaded Germany when it had failed to make reparations payment in 1923. So here, France, again, one of the members, the permanent members of the Council of the League of Nations, should they have invaded Germany? You can argue not, considering the aim of the League of Nations was to stop aggression and military force. France in that situation, in theory, should have gone through the League of Nations. However, because Germany wasn't a member of the League of Nations, the League couldn't do anything at that point. So France had to solve it themselves. You can see how desperate they were, because obviously Germany missing one payment, France absolutely needs that money to be able to rebuild. And by not letting Germany in this point, the League and France have shot themselves in the foot. But things couldn't continue like this. In 1925, the German Foreign Minister, Gustav Stresemann, invited the French Foreign Minister, Briand, to meet and sign a treaty to help improve relations between the two old enemies. Okay, so particularly Germany is keen for this. Germany was the country that suggested the Locarno Treaties, and since they were not a member of the League of Nations, the meetings were organised independently. So the League, in theory, should have been the ones to have done this, because they were the peacekeeping organisation, but they weren't involved at all. French and German representatives met in Locarno in Switzerland, so neutral territory, where they signed 7 treaties in which Germany officially accepted the borders that the Treaty of Versailles had defined, giving up any claim they had on areas such as Alsace-Lorraine. They also agreed to work together to try to settle disputes peacefully. So we know that Germany isn't in the League yet because they haven't proved that they want peace. This is them declaring that they do. So, won't let me go up. Sorry, it's a bit technical. There we go. So the treaty was also signed by Britain, Italy, Belgium, and Czechoslovakia. Again, Britain and Italy, members of the Council of the League of Nations. Each country agreed not to go to war with any of the others. So again, what the League wanted them to do. And that if one of the countries broke the treaty, they would support the country that was invaded. This was very significant for Germany, who feared that the Treaty of Versailles had left them vulnerable to French attack. So they've got backup now. So they were extremely significant. They were an end to the German resentment of the Treaty of Versailles because they signed it voluntarily. They weren't forced to. Remember, we saw Germany being force-fed that pill. Other countries saw this as Germany trying to become a peaceful nation, and therefore in 1926 they were allowed to join the League of Nations. However, this treaty marked a failure for the League of Nations, which should have been at the forefront of any international agreements regarding peace, but had had nothing to do with it. And it had had nothing to do with it because Germany was not allowed into the League of Nations. So we can see here, we've got a newspaper on from Britain in 1925, signing the pact to end war. Now, surely that should have been the Treaty of Versailles. However, it wasn't. Well, as in the Treaty of Versailles was the pact that ended the war, but this is the one that Germany is finally accepting. So this is a very positive interpretation of what the Locarno Treaties did. So then let's have a look at the Kellogg-Briand Pact. So this is in 1928. It's 3 years later, and Germany at this point is a part of the League of Nations. It's the year before the Wall Street crash, so things economically are looking more positive, particularly for the US. So 65 countries. Now remember, at its peak, most of the time the League has 48 countries in it, and at its peak it has 58. So 65 more countries than involved in the League of Nations meet in Paris, where they signed an agreement stating that they would not use war as a way to solve disputes. The first countries that were involved were Germany, France, and the USA. So Germany and France, we know, were already in the League. The League was suggested by the USA, but they hadn't joined it. So because the Germany and the USA were not members of the League of Nations, Germany was by this point, this agreement took place outside of the League. So again, another peace treaty that the League is not involved with, but that is its overall aim. So what's the point of it? So individual countries acted independently of the League and made it look like it was a place for countries to air their problems without being a place where a practical solution could be found. So the League's basically there to go and have a big moan. You can have a moan at the League, you can tell them your problems, but they're not necessarily going to do anything about it. The members of the League and even the leaders of the League are going somewhere else to find the solution to their problems. So we've got a picture here. I'm going to come back to that picture actually at the end. So we've now got the Washington Arms Conference so a few little facts for you here, 1921 to 22. So one of the aims of the League of Nations was to encourage disarmament, but it was not involved in the first International Arms Conference. So this was organised and held in the USA, and remember, the USA suggested but was not a part of the League. Major countries such as Britain, France and Japan, again, permanent members of the League of Nations Council, so should have been doing everything through the League of Nations, attended and discussed how big navies could be. They are in the peacekeeping organisation that wants international disarmament, and yet they're going to a conference and saying, yeah, you can have a navy, even though that's totally, so it really does show you how the League of Nations is there kind of for show. It's not in the back of everybody's mind, because everybody is out to look after their own country. So it was decided that Britain and the USA could have the same size navies, and that for every 5 tons of each of their battleships weighed, Japan could have 3 tons, right? So all of these countries were allowed navies. So the fact that Britain, France, and Japan attended as individual countries rather than sending representatives through the League says a lot about their attitude towards the League and what their priorities were. So their priorities were their own countries. Okay, and again, this is absolutely them undermining the League. Okay, and then we've got the Rapallo Treaty of 1922. So Russia was forced to leave the First World War and they had to surrender to Germany. This was in 1917 after the Russian Revolution. They were made to sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which they had taken away vast quantities of land and forced Russia to pay heavy reparations to Germany. Now, this is the treaty that people talk about when they say, well, if Germany had won, the Treaty of Versailles would have been a lot harsher on Britain and France than Britain and France were on Germany, because of how harsh Germany had been on Russia. They said, look, we're letting you off lightly, and we know that because we've seen how you've punished Russia. So, but in 1922, representatives from Germany and Russia met in Rapallo in Italy to sign a treaty. They agreed that Germany would return the money and land that Russia had lost, and that the 2 countries would cooperate in the future. This treaty did not involve the League of Nations, as neither Germany nor Russia had been allowed to join by 1922. So again, they are the peacekeeping organisation, but they are not involved in another attempt to keep the peace. So let's just go back then to this picture of the Kellogg-Briand Pact. So this is from a French magazine published in August 1928, and it shows Gustav Stresemann here, who's signing the Briand-Kellogg Pact, renouncing aggression and war and prohibiting the use of war as an instrument of national policy, except in matters of self-defense. And he is in the presence of the French Foreign Minister Briand here. And in the background, there is an angel as a symbol of peace, holding an olive branch as a symbol of peace. And at the back here, we've got all the other countries who are involved in that pact. So all of those other 65 countries. Okay, so we can see there are a lot of examples, again, in the 1920s, of disputes being solved in ways that should have been handled by the League of Nations. However, due to the fact that the League of Nations was not allowing the defeated parties to be involved, they had to go around it and find their own ways. And because the League of Nations was totally against military and using military means to solve disputes, countries who still wanted to keep their militaries, including members of the Council of the League of Nations, again went around the League and figured out their problems by themselves. So the League is rendered completely useless in a lot of these examples. Okay, so I hope that was useful for you. Thank you for joining in this video. And if you join me in the next one, we will be looking at the impact of the Depression on the League's ability to keep peace and the rise of the extremist parties. So thank you very much, and I will see you soon.